thank you both for coming today on my little show. I'm so excited to have both of you here from a very, very, very amazing anthology. So I'm going to describe, first of all, these two wonderful women who have actually compiled and edited this anthology. So starting with Gabrielle Deonath is a Guyanese-American Muslim writer and editor. First published at the age of 16, she penned personal essays on her experiences navigating the world as a Muslim teenager. She served as an assistant editor at Brown Girl magazine for 5 years and is an editor of the company's first ever print anthology. Gabrielle hopes to continue to give a voice to those without a platform and create an authentic representation of minorities and marginalized communities through storytelling. Her next book venture is Shukr, an inspirational dua and gratitude journal for women, which is coming to a bookstore near you in spring 2022. And we're going to obviously introduce our lovely Kamini Ramdeen-Chowdhury, who is a Guyanese-American editor and writer. She works at theSkimm as a senior news editor, covering stories to help millennial women live their smartest lives. She also aims to spark conversations about first-generation American identity in her writing and art, found at Paulo Grand. She's formerly worked at Brown Girl magazine and Verizon, and Verizon Media, and she's now she is also the co-editor of Untold, Defining Moments of the Uprooted, which is their first anthology together. So obviously, thank you both for coming. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
Yes, thank you for having us.
Okay, so Gabrielle, I think you're about to say why you think people don't tell their stories.
Well, I think it differs for different people. I think when it comes to this experience of editing Untold, a lot of what we've come across or noticed is that, and I think this is true for a lot of people from the South Asian diaspora or from a South Asian background, and also other traditional communities where you feel like, well, there's a lot of stigmas and taboos around certain topics that aren't talked about. Because we don't talk about certain topics, it makes it seem like it's not okay or that it's something to hide, talking about infertility or divorce or mental health. And these things are now being talked about a little bit more, but again, not the same way that it's talked about per se in like American culture or in broader like UK culture. So I think that that's part of it. And then I also think that there's like a level of like respect. So when we're talking about stories that have to do with our families, for example, it's sometimes hard to be honest because it's always about what will people think, right? Like that's what we're taught to be the first thought in our mind. And so I think a lot of people, when they're first starting to tell their stories, kind of struggle with how much do I tell? How do I be authentic to my own experiences while still being respectful of my family? And one of the things that we kind of just had to do as editors is just kind of help them through that process and kind of just let them know, like, it's okay to tell your story. It's okay. This is not disrespectful to just be authentic in your own truth, you know? Do you have anything else to add, Kamini?
Yeah, I mean, I think that hits the nail right on the head, 100%. Like these are a lot of times were considered to be taboo stories, but they're like very common experiences that happen to women. And nobody in our cultures are really talking about it and being sympathetic about it or just saying like, this is what happened to me. And this is my experience and where it is that I was in that exact moment of when this happened. And I think that that's something so unique about this book and unique about the storytelling about this is it's not a resolve really, but you just get that drop, that moment, that emotion attached to something that we don't talk about. So I think that Untold is like a book that I hope starts like conversations based upon that, like finding a common ground through these stories.
Yeah, no, I totally understand that. Yeah, some of the stories are so hard hitting. Like, God, there were just moments where, you just have to kind of take a breath and kind of just go with it. Because again, there were quite a few trigger warnings throughout the book, but very important stories. And for both of you, I was just wondering, what was it like emotionally to compile these stories? Because it is so raw.
I'd say it felt like it was like a really big responsibility. You know, you want to make sure that the writer is, and a lot of these writers are who are incredibly talented, each and every one of them, and so brave. For some of them, this is like the first time they're going through editing. So not only are you telling a very personal moment to a stranger, basically, but that person is also coming back and like giving you corrections on this work. So like that was also a part of like our process in creating these stories, is like just being really well aware of that and knowing that, you know, these came with great care, and would need great care. I hope that like answers part of that question. I like just got so caught up in like even remembering how we did all of that at that time.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, I think that there's two sides of it. So I definitely agree with what Kamini said. I think that that was a big part of it. Also, for us both being, you know, I was an assistant editor under Kamini actually at Brown Girl, and at Brown Girl on the digital side of things, we were writing about politics and identity and these other things. And sometimes it can be personal, but it's not stories that are this raw and vulnerable and emotional, because it's just a different platform, right? News and media is very different than creative writing, for example. And I think also with this, like we were pushing a lot of the writers, a lot of the initial feedback that we gave them was dig deeper.
Yeah.
And when there's stories of this nature, that could be very hard. So we had to understand the gravity of what we were asking, or like how, like what we're really asking these writers to do. But they all rose to the challenge, you know, because it's in this genre of creative nonfiction, right? You're kind of writing a story with all the literary elements of like a fictional story. So you do kind of need the imagery, you need to have the characterization, you need to have, you know, great dialogue, and like that is obviously authentic to the moment, but also included in there. And sometimes somebody said something that you don't want to put in there, or sometimes also when it's your own personal story, there are holes in the actual piece that you just can't see, right? That's happened to me before too. Like even when you tell a story to a friend, sometimes they'll ask you clarifying questions because it's just a detail you didn't think of to ask. So sometimes they had to revisit it multiple times just to say like, hey, here's something that we'd like you to fill in and go a little bit deeper on, so that the reader can really feel like they're walking through this moment with you and experiencing it by your side. So I think that was a challenge of like the genre. It's not just like writing an essay. It's definitely a lot more detailed. But yeah, so I think it was emotional for us in the sense of having to think about the emotions of the writers and making sure that we were taking care of them while also still doing our job by, you know, pushing them as editors and really working with them to get the best that we could. And on the other side of it is, I think when we, at the very last read through, it was like a 14-hour day. We both, I think, took the day off of work, or we were both off for some reason. And we just spent the whole day reading through these stories. And as we were reading through them, we stopped. And it was the first time we could do this because we weren't so focused on the words, because the words were taken care of at this point, where we stopped and we talked about different experiences and how we related to a lot of these stories in our own way. And then that's when we stopped, and Kami and I had a conversation like what you mentioned earlier of like, I hope that other people do this, where they read these stories and they want to have conversations about it. And so I think there's an emotional connection to these stories the same way readers will have them, because we know, you know, we've experienced a lot of these things, or we know people that have. So yeah, so I think those are like the kind of the two emotional, and that's also incredibly fulfilling, I feel like, as editors, to know that we've kind of compiled this anthology that is relatable to people's experiences and that can provoke these conversations that, like you pointed out, we're not having we're not having often.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you mentioned that the whole process took what, a year and a half, and what, there were 150 submissions, is that correct? So how did you pick the stories?
I mean, that part was very difficult to do. I think initially, you know, we got that down to maybe like 160. No, I'm sorry. We got it down to 60. What am I saying? And that weeding, I wouldn't call it weeding them out. I would just say like evaluating the pitches and seeing which one was stronger, which one kind of came with a little bit of the more of the prompt that was created, and like creating something that could read as creative work that's nonfiction, which can be really hard to do, and the compelling stories that do that. And then, you know, we sent out 60, I think, plus yeses. And from there, it was the people who really wanted to continue to share their story, you know, because it is a difficult process to go back to these, you know, let's be honest, some of these moments are traumatic for these women. So to go back to that moment and really dive in about how you felt, not only in that moment and knowing your whole story or where you may be at with it now, but how you felt in that exact moment and re-feeling some of those feelings, can be very difficult to do. So like not everybody wanted to move forward with their pitch, you know, just because it was selected, and that's totally understandable. So I think different factors kind of weigh into how it came down to the 32 that are in there. But a lot of it really had to do with the subject matter, I would say. And just like the call for the prompt and like wanting to go through that editing process too, because again, you're entrusting somebody who you don't know with like that most private moment, and being very authentic and truthful in the way that Gabby mentioned. And that can be really difficult to do. So, and a lot of the conversations that we had with writers, you know, were a lot of just about what Gabby said, like digging deeper, getting to like the heart of that moment. And a lot of people were having like, you know, not only revisiting those moments were hard, but then looking at them through the lens of where they're at now can also be difficult too. And like on the reader's end of it, they're experiencing that for themselves, because, you know, you think in your life and you connect to, where have I like heard about something like this? Where have I seen this? Have I seen it in my own life? And then you kind of are experiencing that emotion as well. Something that you mentioned that, you know, is that we did include trigger warnings in this book. And I think that it was very needed. And I think that that was something that we talked about, me and Gabby, like really early on. And just like the language for what that would be, and like hopefully like even adding a line, you know, no matter where you are in the world, like adding some sort of phone number in some place that you can call if you do feel something. We talked about that as being really important, of just like being able to take care of the reader in that way, because, you know, some of the stories can be heavy.
Even on like the trigger warnings, we were also very intentional on the placement of them.
Yeah.
Because I think sometimes trigger warnings can appear at the top of a story or on the side of a story. And so we were very intentional of flagging them in the table of contents so people are aware, but also making sure that it is like the page before. So if it starts on page 3, page 1 is a trigger warning, not page 2, because if you still have to glance at it, you know, you never know what could be triggering to somebody. And so taking care of the reader in that way of just like, where this is a trigger warning and you don't have to see anything else beyond this if you don't want to go there. But in terms of curating the stories, it was, some of it was what Kamini was saying about whether they wanted to go forward in telling their stories. Some of it was also communication. Some people just kind of fell off. And then it's also what stories kind of fit the criteria that we were looking for. So I think in the beginning, we kind of cast a broader net. And then we were a little bit, like each time we were more focused on the criteria. And the criteria was that it had to be a specific moment or a very focused string of moments that were related together, or related to each other rather. And then also like making sure that they could get their creative nonfiction style down, and have all those literary elements that we were talking about. So if the story doesn't necessarily lend itself to that, if it doesn't lend itself to dialogue, if it's about somebody alone in a room with themselves, you know, it depends on what the topic was and whether or not it kind of fit the criteria. There are ways around it in whatever situation you're writing about. And then also, if we got stories about the same topic, sometimes it was just about who could really dig the deepest, like she was talking about, and really go there. And because that was our goal with this anthology, was to show the authentic truths of these topics, whatever it was that we're, you know, all 31 that we're covering.
Thank you guys. I really appreciate you guys for sharing that, because yeah, no, definitely it was a very raw and I'm sure quite yeah, quite a process to go through. And obviously, Gabrielle, you shared your own story in this anthology. So what do you think, what did it feel like for you to share that story in the book?
I was just going to say, based off of what you just said, like, yeah, of course it was like a process for us, but I mean, the credit really goes to the 32 writers that were willing to put their lives and their stories and their moments down on paper, because I think that's the emotional core of Untold. And without the writers, we just would not have this amazing collection of stories. Um, for me, writing my own story, it reminded me of being in college, because I was the editor-in-chief of the school newspaper in my senior year. And the thing that I had to write, the editor's note, was always like the last thing in the book. So for me, my story, I was not focused on it at all, because I was just so focused on everybody else's stories and wanting to serve them and do right by them. And so I was still on the fence about it until like 2 weeks before, and then I finally just decided to do it. I think it is nerve-wracking in the sense that you always want to do your best. And so I think I always have this worry of like, oh, I don't want this to be mediocre. I don't want to like do kind of like a half-baked job, if that makes sense. But when I shared it with Kamini, and she was like, this is great, and I have very little edits for you. And I was like, okay, so then this is good. I very much trust her judgment on that. But sharing my story was great. I think one of the reasons why it was so important for me is we represent a lot of different parts of the diaspora in Untold. But being a hijabi, I don't see a lot of that representation, even in the representation that we do have, whether it's television or books or movies. And that's starting to change a little bit. There are some authors, but again, it's like one or two authors, So, and those are also fictional stories. So to be able to tell my hijab story and to create that representation was really important. And that was something that Kamini brought up to me as well. She was like, yeah, you should 100% tell this story, and just to increase the level of representation that we have for so many different communities within the South Asian diaspora. And it's also interesting to write a story in that way, like as if it's fiction, but it's actually real life, right? So it was interesting to relive. I've written about that journey before, but in essay format. So doing this was completely different and very special. And yeah, it was great. It was, for me, it felt just like great to share that story in a brand new way. I think perhaps if it was a different topic, again, I think there's more complicated feelings within that, but mine was just a story about self-discovery at a very young age. And yeah, I kind of just ended up walking away like, wow, I can't believe I was 15 when I did that.
Wow, I didn't realize you were so young either. Wow, that's a huge thing. Yeah, but it was such
Yeah.
a fascinating, journey to hear as well, because as you say, not many people do that. And I know one of my friends who made that decision, similar age, and it was really hard for her because she didn't have anyone to talk to about it. So it was really, really quite heartwarming to see that story there, because I'm so sure that so many people are going to go through that journey themselves. So really appreciate it. And obviously, apart from your story and you, Kamini, as well, but were there any particular other stories that really kind of stood out for you, that really kind of left you with a feeling?
Oh, that's such an unfair question. I think like every single one of them did that in its own way. I don't know if I could pick just one, so I'll have to speak about a few, like I feel, and not just one. I think that one that really stuck out to me, if I had to choose, was the story at the very end, which was Sabina's story about love and just like heartbreak and mourning and grief. And I feel like in that span, readers got a little bit more to the story than they did with some of the other ones. Like this one had more of like, I wouldn't say an ending, but like a beginning again at the very end of that, about just like where you go afterwards, after like loving somebody so much. And I think that's like one of the reasons why maybe we put it at the end. Like there's a little bit of just like the phoenix rising at all times at the end of that particular story. So I think like the function of it for how it wraps into the entire anthology is so interesting. But then just like what we're able to offer the reader through that story is also interesting, and just so raw and vivid. And like the writing was just so like, she shared her true soul like with us, even in the pitch. Like that story from the original pitch was like a very like, wow, like we want to hear more of what it is that you have to say, like want to hear more. So I would say that one was definitely one that stuck out immediately. Geez, so many. I think all the stories that had to do with like sharing grief, I thought those as a whole were so interesting. I thought Nooper's story about like body and how we evaluate the body, like within ourselves, within the gaze of our parents, within the gaze of others in comparison to our friends. Like, I think it's like very interesting because you connect with that immediately. And like you connect with so many of the emotions that people are sharing with each other. And nothing, and Kimberly's story, like that story about just like friendship. Female friendship is such an interesting connection, right? Like, I feel like we don't talk about it enough. Like, female friendship is like, sometimes it can be like your strongest bond. Like, you're more heartbroken in a way about losing your girlfriends, your support system, than sometimes like women could be about losing a boyfriend. Like, it's almost devastating sometimes. And like them talking about just like their bond through something that seems so, you at times could be seeming impossible, and like feeling all of the emotions that they felt like. And I felt like that story was also so unique for the reader because you're going in and out of two different people's view on the same topic. So I thought that one was really, really interesting. And I can go on and on and on and on. So you need to cut me off at some point. But I thought Sabrina's story as well, just like about like her family, like and losing her sister and the way that she did was, and then her talking about mental illness. Like, I thought that was just so interesting because you get it from all sides. Like, how does somebody who is also dealing with mental illness now also deal with something that is impossible to deal with no matter who you are? You know what I mean? Like, and that view, I think that offers something so unique to the reader themselves, is that they're hearing somebody's stories as they've lived their lives with everything that comes with that. And we all are doing that all the time. Everybody on this call, everybody who watches this, everyone who's hearing it, like they're doing it on their own. And you're not alone in that experience, but that experience feels lonely. And I think like that's the unique thing that all these stories bring to the reader, and then to these writers, and then to us. So yeah, picking one, impossible. But I think that as a whole, like collection, they do so well at working together, but still being so individual in the subtlety of those lives and those moments.
Yeah, I definitely think the breast cancer story, which is the only story in the anthology that's written by two of our authors, is definitely impactful. And I think everybody will feel that way just from reading it, but also because I think we all know somebody that has breast cancer, whether they're close or, you know, further in distance. And yeah, I think that was just such an important story to talk about, especially because they were diagnosed before the age of 40. And I think to us, that was one of the most like surprising parts about their story. And then there were just stories like, you know, like Sabina's story that we talked about, which is the last story in the anthology, that we read it, and that was kind of like the jaw-dropping one that we kind of just like looked at each other after we read that pitch, and we were just like, yep, we're definitely including that one, where we definitely want to read more, you know. Who were the other standouts? I think MK Ansari's story, Whispering of the Jinn, was a really important story as well, because it has that element of spirituality, in the sense that when you're experiencing mental illness or are struggling with mental health, often people will tell you to pray, or they will tell you that it's a spiritual issue. And so I felt like that was a really important thing to highlight. So that was a really great story, and just well written, and very impactful. What else? And I also think The Good Guy, I think that's what it's called, Rajveer's story, where she talks about, also it was like,
her pitch was funny. Her pitch was, she had a funny pitch. Like it was eye-catching because it made us laugh, both of us.
Yeah, and it's like conflicting because it's a heavy story, and you know, like this is a very personal experience for her. But it starts out with her, you know, the first line I think is that her husband wants to bring his mother to couples therapy. And like, how do you not laugh, you know? So it's one of those kind of like more like darker humored stories. But I remember that being a conversation, like, are we supposed to be laughing right now?
And like, what mother-in-law wants to come to your therapy session? Like that was like insane. That's incredibly eye-catching pitch for sure. But
I think the other, go ahead.
Like she talks about going through a divorce, you know, and like that is something that I don't feel like we talk about enough in our community. And if you're living in the US, like we have a high rate of divorce in this country. It's happening, but like we're not talking about it, but the diaspora is experiencing it.
And there's so much layered into that story too. I mean, there's infidelity and also mental health and all of these things, you know, and even when you get divorced, the blame is often put on the woman rather than the man, no matter what the man has done, you know, like it's not based on the circumstance. It's kind of always the woman's fault. The woman couldn't keep the person, you know, the man happy or whatever it is. And then the other standout one that I just thought of, it's called Dark and Lovely. And it touches kind of on, it's like a play on the Fair and Lovely, what do they call it? Brightening cream now. But it was written by Apoorva, who I think is our youngest writer. She was 17 when she wrote the story, so amazing. But it includes like this, like what Bollywood and, you know, pop culture kind of teaches you about beauty standards. But I think that was really important to kind of just highlight, like we all know that, we all have talked about, I'm sure, the unrealistic standards of Bollywood, and what it like, and also perpetuate the fact that it perpetuates like European standards of beauty is like beyond me. But
they got everywhere. Like those European standards of beauty, like got around the world. Like they didn't just stay in Europe or even just they were not even just into India. Like it spread all over India. India is huge. And then it went everywhere. That was definitely in the US too. Like, and then we followed it for a while. Like it's not like it just came and went. It was like, all right, like we're gonna keep.
And I think in a lot of ways it's still there. I mean, I think that's like imperialism. That's like the unseen part of effects of imperialism. You know what I mean? But so those are like some of just like the standout stories. But again, I think there are stories in Untold for every person. Some might relate. It was really great when we got to read like early reviews from people, whether it was just readers or actual people who were reviewing the book, because there were certain stories that stood out to them and others stood out to us, and then there are other stories that stood out to other people. And I think that's the part that we love the most, that there's something for everybody and you can walk away feeling like you are not alone. I think that was the biggest part for us, is like, if people can walk away from this book feeling like they're not alone in their struggles, or even, you know, just in their experiences in general. Not all the stories are, you know, sad or traumatic, but just to not feel like you're not alone in whatever it is that you're going through, is the feeling that we wanted to just endure afterwards.
Thank you so much, because guess what, Gabrielle, you know, that's exactly what I ended up doing, which was I reached out to some of your authors because they shared their experiences and it really resonated with me. So it was really, I think you guys managed to, you hit it on the nail there. In terms of like resonating with people and trying to get that conversation moving. So I really appreciate it. And speaking of imperialism, as you have mentioned, what was it like for both of you to straddle two different cultures in America?
You know, I don't think that that's like an experience that you realize you're going through, like as you're going through it, you know? Like that's like also like one of those subtle things that like kind of sneak up on you. And then one day you realize like you've been, you know, kind of like one person going to school and, you know, being in those environments outside of your home. And then you kind of like are in different mindset maybe when you're like with your family or like with your like friends that also are part of your culture, you know, it's a little bit different. And I don't think that I really always realized that that was the case. I think for a while you just feel like that's normal. And that is normal as well. Like for so many people everywhere, it's still my normal in a lot of ways, you know? But I think that it's been a very interesting experience, like just realizing how different I am from my parents, like who also came here but lived, you know, in our home country of Guyana for such a long time, and how we are experiencing this place together but very differently at the same time. Like I think like that is something that I find to be like very mind-boggling about the entire experience as a whole, is that you're very much not alone going through it, but it's incredibly subjective how much of you will be a part of the American culture, you know, like, and there's a penalty for that. Like sometimes when you're younger in your family, you know, our families are big, right? Like, so like, it's like a lot of people sometimes are cued into what it is that you may be doing or experiencing. And there's a lot of shame around that. So then I think it kind of forces you in a way to kind of be a little bit different when you're like in settings that your family is not. And I think that's sometimes when maybe I realized it. Like I realized that this is a little bit different. But besides that, like, I don't know, I think that is like a normal that people just exist within, those two normals. And I would really be interested to hear Gabby's take on it, about like what you experienced.
Yeah, I think the thing as soon as you asked that question, the thought that occurred in my mind first is it's almost like I don't know if Kamini feels that way, but Kamini and I are both Indo-Caribbean American. Yes. So for me, I don't even just feel like it's juggling two cultures. I feel like it's juggling three, because even though our culture being being Indo-Caribbean, you know, we wear lengas and shalwars and we eat curry and we like the culture is not that different, right? But it's still removed from the South Asian subcontinent. So I feel like there was just like a lot of that. I feel like it's like, yes, I was born here. I don't really need to feel like I know this part. I know the American culture part, right? And then there's the Guyanese side of it, the Caribbean side, and then there's the Indian part of me that is even more removed. And I don't know a lot about my family history beyond Guyana. Where are we from? I don't know, you know, and that's not everybody's experience. But I think that played a very big part in my identity, or the search for my identity, and why I write about the things that I do. And that's informed a lot of just my writing and just me as a person. And so I think that for me, that's kind of been like the biggest thing, like that disconnection from India, and that knowing that we're from there, but not really knowing what language, you know, my ancestors spoke since 6 generations ago. And there's general information, right? Like we know that there are certain languages that Indians who came from India to Guyana spoke, whether it's Bhojpuri or Hindi or whatever it is, but that's the general, you know, like I don't know the answers about my specific ancestors and family. And so I feel like a lot of that, like that's occupied a lot of my mind, and like weirdly, like since from a very young age.
100% same. I totally agree. I experienced that as well, because like you do feel lost in your own cultural identity sometimes when there is so many historical factors to it. I 100% agree with that. And I feel like a lot of Indo-Caribbean women and men as well would. It's such a unique identity. And you get a lot of pushback from other cultures as well, you know, like being a part of the Indo-Caribbean identity, finding your footing with it is also looking like other cultures that are so removed from your own, you know?
Yeah.
And like, that is something that is mentally like can be a block, you know, it could just be like even harder, one step harder. It's like a missing rung on the cultural identity ladder of like, what am I, of like jumping over that, is realizing that like, okay, yeah, you know, I kind of look like this group, but my culture is partially that, yes, but it's also very different than just that, you know, like that is not the 100% makeup of it. It may not even be. And I think for everybody, the sliding scale of how much of that is dependent upon the person. And And I think that is something that we all should just respect. Because just like in any group that has factions of how they think about their culture, like it's just something that's like, okay, well, maybe they're too Indian, like they show their Indian side way too much, you know, like that could be something that's a demerit for someone. But for you, this is like your cultural like acceptance of self, and that should be fine. And they'd be like, there's people that's like, you're too Caribbean, you know. And then also having the American part in it is very difficult too, because there's people who are obviously born in Guyana, and like their experience when they say they're Guyanese is very much like, oh, but I am, you know. And for us, it's like, no, we're Guyanese-American, and that culture is different. And we're both first generation for that culture. And you know, going into that experience, this is something that all of the books, you know, all the stories in Untold also have, is that experience of that added third layer that we don't talk about enough, is like, now we're the first generation experiencing this culture, and now we're creating another layer to our culture. And I think that that's like very, very interesting idea of what that looks like, but it's so incredibly subjective again. When you have, and in our culture a little harder, because you're still formulating your idea of that culture layer on top of it and where you fit in with that. And that is something that is just like omnipresent in a way. Like that is always like the omnipresent presence. Of the
I think it's like, and it's just like interesting. So like, you know, being American and being a person of color, you're, for some people, not necessarily American, right? And being Guyanese, if you're around South Asian people, you don't speak the languages that they speak, right? And you don't necessarily eat the exact same foods or know the culture in the way that they might. They can specifically talk about a specific area of whichever country they're from, whether it's Pakistan or Bangladesh or India, but you don't have roots to speak of, right? You can't be very specific in your, like, there's not a lot you can contribute to that discussion, you know? And even for me, like my family, my parents came here when they were pretty young, and we've never been back to Guyana because they've never felt like that it was safe enough to take us back. But like, even with that, it's like, I don't, like, America is what I know, that this is what I know the most of. This is the family story I know. For as long as we've been here, this is the story that I'm most aware of. But yeah, so it's a lot of not feeling, and I know that's also the string that ties together a lot of the stories in Untold, is not feeling like enough of either one, right? So because I think a lot of them are primarily like South Asian from Pakistan or India or Bangladesh. And we do have a few Indo-Caribbean stories. I just want to add that. But still there is that feeling of not necessarily feeling as Indian or Pakistani or Bengali enough, and then not feeling American enough, you know? And I think that that's a common struggle. And so it's great that this book also brings that out with so many different topics, and that's also a topic of conversation, and that we can acknowledge that, because I think we all feel it. But I think it was Kamini that just said, I don't think we talk about that enough. We don't ever discuss that and what it really means to be South Asian American in whatever form that fits for you.
So, okay, so do you find that South Asians or people of color generally, or actually people who have sort of intersectional identities from marginal groups, have like much less of a platform or a voice to actually showcase?
Yeah, I think so. I think that it's changing. You know, like, even, I don't know if this show is in the UK, but even in the US, like there's the show called Transplant, and I actually think it's a Canadian show, but it's about this, I believe, a Syrian refugee who becomes a doctor in Canada. And that's such like a unique thing to see. And of course, that's not a real story, but I feel like to see that representation, I think that more stories are being told for marginalized communities and all communities across the board. So I think that it's changing. But are we there yet? Are we there at equal representation yet? I don't think so. And I think it's going to be a long time until we get there and have the same opportunities. I also think that if you have a show about a specific, like somebody who is basically a colored character, a character of color, or a cast of color, do I think that it's probably harder to make that movie or make that show or write a book with characters who are all of that and have it published and have it out there? Yeah, I do. And how far do those stories reach, right? I think sometimes when we have with these, whether they're South Asian authors or entertainers or whatever it is, they do create content for us, right? And that we can relate to. But how far does that content get? Does that, the way that, you know, so many books that I read, like Junie B. Jones or whatever I read as a child, where they're stories of white characters, they travel to all different areas and sections and, you know, groups. Do our stories do that? Not yet. I think that they get in, I'm sure they do. I think, you know, like Hassan Minhaj, are there, you know, non-colored people that watch his show? Yeah, I think so. I've seen some of them at his shows that I've been to. But it's not quite there yet. But I think that we're in a really hopeful spot. There's hope. And I think that we will get there eventually.
Yeah, I think that now is like sort of like a renaissance time where people are seeing like just like the value of like sharing stories about women of color, of people of color generally. And I think Untold is like now part of that canon as well, of like telling these stories to our community, like just saying like our stories are valuable and important. And I think that those stories are becoming more and more valuable and more in front of, you know, people's minds and, you know, in front of their eyes. Mindy Kaling shows, like the stuff that she's produced, like, you know, we're seeing it now on Netflix, like more of our like actual like parts of our experience, even if it's not our exact portion of the culture. Like, I think the more like, you know, you break down like the different parts of that overall culture, like have every single group of South Asians, like people who identify as South Asian, as people who identify as, you know, Indo-Caribbean, like, have we seen like the tip of the iceberg? Like, have we seen the iceberg? No. Like, I think that now, like, you know, it's starting to become more apparent that we, you know, in the mainstream culture, that we need to tell more stories of different groups. But now those groups as well are like saying to themselves, like, there is value in that. And I think that the more that we see those examples of those stories out there, the more encouragement it gives for the community themselves to say, yeah, like, I want to see that. And there's no experience like seeing somebody of your culture doing something on screen. Like, there's no like other experience like it. It feels great. You want to root for that person, go out and tell more of our stories. But a part of that, outside of that representation, is like the story that that actor is telling. Like, it has to be like our story from our experience too. So I think that there's writers who are doing that more. And I think that we're going to start seeing more of it. But Untold, like, I hope is now just part of that journey.
I feel like it's interesting because I was just talking about this yesterday, but I also feel like there are two issues, I feel like, in terms of like the stories that we are seeing. One of them is, yes, there may be South Asian actors in the movie, but who is telling the story? Mm-hmm. Who's the director? Lion, Slumdog Millionaire, The White Tiger, any of these popular, Life of Pi, any of these popular stories that like enter the like American lexicon or, you know, Western minds and in front of Western eyes, are Indian people actually telling those stories? Are they the director and the writer and behind those stories? Because the actor can only really portray what's on paper. So it's a step in the right direction to have actors, you know, playing those, you know, Indian actors playing Indian roles and having that representation, or South Asian actors playing South Asian roles. But also, it's also about having authentic storytelling around that, right? Like, and I'm not saying that, let's say a white person, Danny Boyle, I think was the director for Slumdog Millionaire. Is that not, like, that's his story, and that's great that he came up with that story, and I'm sure he did a lot of research, and that's fine. But would that look a lot different through the eyes of a person that was born in India or part of the Indian diaspora or South Asian diaspora? I think so. So that's one of the things that I kind of have like an issue with sometimes. I just always watch those movies and think, I just wonder, like, what would that look like if it was made by a South Asian person, right? And then the other side of it is sometimes they are directed and produced and written by South Asian people or South Asian American people or whatever part of the world they're from. But they like sometimes like I don't get into certain things because I feel like they pander to white people. It panders to, or just not even white people, but not a South Asian audience, right? Like, and I get it because in order to sell something, it has to appeal to a broad audience. But then I feel like you alienate the people that you're trying to create representation for, because truthfully, like whether it was Priyanka Chopra and Quantico, or there are other shows that I won't go into like the whole thing, but I feel like it's alienating because I don't really recognize these people as like relatable. Do you know what I mean? Because I don't know. So those are like the two issues I have with the representation that is out there right now. But there are also really amazing things that are happening. And I'm actually like, I think the things that the stories that I actually like the most are the stories that come out of India, who are by Indian production houses. And I say this because they usually have Bollywood actors in them, but it's usually like the Amazon Prime shows, or the Netflix shows, or whatever. I like Made in Heaven is one of the Amazon Prime shows that I really enjoyed. Great storytelling, great writing, I thought. Not necessarily like high profile actors. I think they're becoming more high profile now. But I relate to that, and I see that, and I feel like it's authentic, and I get it. Do you know what I mean? And I don't feel like it's alienating at all, even though I don't live in India and I don't have the same experiences as they do. So hopefully, again, we're in a hopeful spot. Things will hopefully get better.
Yeah.
Speaking of, so how do we break the actual stigma of telling these stories? Because obviously a lot of people are just still really scared to have these kind of conversations. So what would be your advice to be like, it's okay to share?
I feel like, one is you have to tell your story when you're ready to tell it. And like, nobody can force you to do that when you're not ready. So I think taking a step back, like, people who want to share their stories, like if you don't feel ready to do that, don't beat yourself up about it. You have to do that when you're ready to do that. So giving ourselves a little bit of a break on that end. And then two, if you're not ready to do that yet, then support the people that are. Like, supporting storytellers is also really important. Making sure that the people who are ready to do that are feeling like, there's people there who are interested in that. And I think the more that you expose yourself and to that world of just like people are sharing their stories, the more people feel more comfortable in having that conversation with somebody else. Like, talking about what Gabby mentioned about Untold, like, I read some of those stories and I'm just kind of like, wow, like this reading somebody else's experience has given me permission to now feel like I can talk about it to somebody else. And it's a very subtle emotion. It's just like reading somebody else's experience now has not only brought up a memory for me, but it makes me feel like, okay, I'm ready to talk about it. Like, if this person was brave enough to do it, I can do it too. And sometimes you might not feel like that after just reading one story, right? Sometimes you need multiple perspectives, but I think a big part of getting there is that, one, doing it when you feel like you're ready to do it, two, executing on that, but then three, making sure that if you're not in a space where you're ready, or even if you are, that you're supporting the folks who are doing it, and at least like reading their work. Like, supporting somebody doesn't have to be as difficult as making sure you're going to every single one of their shows, but do that if you love them, right? But don't beat yourself up if it's just like buying their work, like reading their work, like seeing how you feel about it, how you connect to it. Because it can also be really hard to read an experience of somebody within your culture that doesn't get spoken about a lot, because you've been living your own experience for so long. So just being open to the idea of like other experiences within our culture exists, and that's okay. Telling your story when it's okay, and supporting that art form and that work.
I think in the same way that we're in a pivotal time for like representation, I think we're also in a really pivotal time in terms of the way that we think about things as a community. So I think that whole idea of what will other people say, I think it's starting, it will take a generation, and we are that generation. The next generation, I feel like, will not have the same exact struggles, because we'll be different, right? If we are different, then they won't have those same struggles of, oh, what will my parents say, because they're going to be concerned about what will other people think, right? So that's what I think. I think that we're just in like a very pivotal time, and I think it's going to take a generation from now. People, I feel like, will be, of course, they'll have their own struggles, but I think that they will be a lot more open to sharing their stories. I think even when we talk about just like millennials have this tag for being oversharers, right? Like that's what older people think, that we overshare, but that just means we're more open. And so I think that that will lend itself to being more open about these harder topics, about, you know, all of the different things, whether it's infertility, like I said, or divorce or gun violence or any of the other things that any experience, right? So I think that it will change on its own. But what I also will say is you don't have to pick up a pen and write your story and publish it for it to matter, to feel like you're brave enough to tell your story. It can be as simple as picking up the phone and being brave enough to, because it takes so much courage to share with a friend, this is what I'm going through, this is what I'm feeling. So don't feel like because you've read these stories that in order to be impactful or change, you know, help somebody in their life or help someone feel less alone, you have to go publish your story online or publish it in a book. It does not need to be out there like that. And again, it's what Kamini said, it's what you feel comfortable with. If you want to do that, that's amazing, that's great, definitely go for it. But also just be open. You could just be open with the people in your life, and it doesn't have to be everybody. Just start with one person. Pick up the phone and be vulnerable and let them know what you're going through, and you will often be surprised that they have their own experiences on the same thing that they'll be willing to share with you and relate with you through.
Oh God, that's, yeah, heartwarming advice, because hopefully someone's listening to that will inspire them to just make that first move, or, you know, make them feel comfortable enough to make that first move. So thank you so much for saying that. That's really comforting. I mean, it's comforting to me as well. So yeah, thank you so much. But yeah, and I just want to say a huge thank you to both of you for, you know, persisting with me today, with through all the random tech issues. And so thank you so much for joining today.
Thank you so much for having us. This was so much fun.
Yeah, I really appreciate it.
It was. Thank you so much. And thanks for the wonderful questions.
Yes.
Thank you.